Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This episode is entitled, Did Paul Incite Rebellion, that's apostasy, against God's law of circumcision as to a Christian Gentile who merely wished to participate in the Passover temple services, in which case circumcision becomes necessary? Okay, of course, Passover is voluntary as to a Gentile Christian, maybe not as to a non-Gentile Christian, but as to a Gentile Christian. Yes, it was voluntary. And if you did do it and you wanted to do it at the temple, you had to be what? Circumcised. So it's avoidable, but it's a duty you would have to do if you wanted to go to the temple. God has a very strict rule about anyone who enters this area has to have it been circumcised. Okay. And I'm going to get back to this top left corner a couple times in the video. It's Isaiah 5:20. It's an interesting verse. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. These are people who are morally and legally challenged, who don't know the law, and they get it completely backwards. Paul has this completely backwards, that it's a damnable act if you do circumcision. We'll get to see. Now, I want us to look again at this verse, Isaiah 5:20. And when you study in the book, Encountering the Book of Isaiah by Brian Beyer, he's going to get into it, and he's going to tell you when somebody calls evil good and good evil, they're morally twisted. They're twisted in their brain. They have it opposite the way it really should be. That's exactly what Paul is. He completely has it backwards, not correctly at all, not even close to correct. We'll see. So let's see how Beyer explains this passage. The morally twisted, Isaiah 5:20, the morally twisted of Isaiah's day made their own rules. Paul's making up his own rules, that circumcision is an evil, and that if you do it, you're going to be severed from Christ. It's like a crime, a death penalty, a salvation, ending of salvation. You're severed from Christ by getting circumcised. Amazingly reversed the way it really is. The morally twisted of Isaiah's day made their own rules and established their own standards of morality. That's what Paul's doing. He's claiming circumcision is inimical to your salvation. You'll be severed from Christ if you do it. Isaiah described them as substituting evil for good, darkness for light, and bitter for sweet. The morally twisted people's sin went deeper than merely committing evil practices. They had convinced themselves, Paul has convinced himself, that somehow circumcision is inimical to your salvation and that you shouldn't even try to do it, even though you have to do it if you want to go to the temple, that God has made a strict rule. No uncircumcised person can get there. There's actually a sign on the temple that if you try to enter uncircumcised, you're committing an illegal act and you're subject to a death penalty. All right, let's continue. The morally twisted people's sin went deeper than merely committing evil practices. They had convinced themselves and probably tried to convince others that their practices were actually good. So Paul is thinking that by telling people not to get circumcised, to do an abomination at God's temple, when it's required that you not do that, you get circumcised, he's convinced that he's telling them to do something good. Okay? So he says, if you get circumcised, even if the principle is just, even if the principle is in God's law, because it comes from somewhere. He knows it comes from somewhere, and he knows it applies to Gentiles, even to the Gentiles. If they elect to do Passover, if they elect to do an atonement at the temple, they have to be circumcised, or else the temple has been abominated. So Paul has convinced himself of the opposite, that it's evil, it's going to be destructive, they're going to be severed from Christ, they're going to be damned by doing something that God requires. It's the opposite. It's unbelievable. So Paul has convinced themselves, he's saying here, Beyer, they had convinced themselves and probably tried to convince others that their practices were actually good. They stood guilty of taking all that was evil and calling it good. That's what Paul's doing. He's taking all that is evil, which is the abomination of God's temple, basically allowing behavior, licensing behavior, going in uncircumcised, which that's exactly what his friend Trophimus did in Acts 21. Trophimus violates the middle wall of separation. The Jews of Asia get upset and call out to the Roman guard and say, hey, this Paul has allowed a Trophimus, this person, to defile the temple. The Gentiles are defiling the temple. And so that's why the troops all had to step in and say, what's going on? And they gave this huge protection to Paul, but it's a whole nother digression. For they commended it to themselves and to others. Their sin was much greater than the sin of those who sinned by ignorance. So Paul, his sin here is so deep. It's not even ignorance. It's stupid. It's unbelievably ignorant of God's law, so much so that you can't believe he really didn't know what he was saying is totally off the wall. Really, it is completely off the wall. As Tobias Singh would say, Paul proves himself here either to be a completely total biblical ignoramus, or he's deliberately being an apostate, deliberately telling you to violate God's law and pretending he doesn't know he's telling you to violate God's law. But let's keep going. All right, so let's look at Paul's verses and tell me if these aren't absolutely unequivocal, unconditional statements that are false biblically. Okay. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Whoa. Let's think about it for a minute. Let's say you want to go celebrate Passover and you decided to get circumcised. Paul is saying, I, on my authority, I, Paul, say unto you that you who want to go celebrate Passover, and that's a voluntary thing, you didn't have to do it, but you did do it, but you know you can't do it at the temple without being circumcised. So, but then by obeying God's law, which requires that, I will get into that in a minute, I'll show you the verses on it, is Christ shall profit you nothing. Wow. This is the opposite. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to do, and Christ will bless you because you're supposed to do that. And more importantly, Yahweh will accept you. But if you do it uncircumcised, you can have exactly what happened in the case of Trophimus in Acts 21, where the whole thing went into a crazy reaction. All right, so next, let's look at the next one. Galatians 5:4, Berean Bible. But you who are trying to be justified by the law, so when you obey the law, God says, Moses says in Deuteronomy, when we obey God's law, that is righteousness unto us. So whenever you're doing that, you're doing the right thing, right? It's not the wrong thing. He's making it like when you obey God's law, oh, this is a terrible thing. You'll get it. You'll see. He says, but you are trying to be justified by the law, that is, obey the command to be circumcised in Exodus 12:48 and Ezekiel 44:7-9 for a foreigner to enter the temple. So that's the bottom line. There's two statutes, two prophetic words that require this. But Paul says, you are trying to be justified by the law by obeying these two statutes have been severed from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. That's ridiculous. God says, I extend grace. When does God say this? In the 10 commandments, between the first commandment and the second commandment. Look at the KJV. I extend mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments. It's not how you lose grace by obeying his commandments. That's how you get grace. That's how you get mercy. That's how it said it right in the 10 commandments. My goodness me. He has it all backwards. I really believe that Tobias Singer is correct. Paul was a biblical ignoramus. He has everything backwards. He just doesn't seem to know how to think biblically. Let's continue. Galatians 5:12. I wish these agitators would go so far as to castrate themselves. Oh my gosh. So now these people are so evil and demonic to tell you to do what God's law requires. He wants them to emasculate themselves. I mean, what it's almost, I wonder if it's a parody. Is he making fun of himself? No, he actually believes this stuff. He is totally gone over the edge. And part of me thinks when he says in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 6, he's talking about 6 and 7. He's talking about an angel of Satan is tormenting him in his flesh. I wonder if it's now already corroding his mind that he can't think straight anymore, because these are insane statements, biblically insane, not just false, but over the top crazy statements. I mean, can't you see it? I mean, it's just obvious. Okay, and one more bizarre statement. 1 Corinthians 7:18-19, New English translation. Was anyone called who is uncircumcised? He should not get circumcised. Wait a minute. If I want to go celebrate Passover, celebrate my Lord's request to keep in memory this every year at this time of the year, to remember him by doing this in remembrance of him, the Passover service. That's how it was. It wasn't a communion each week. It was a Passover service. It was done for centuries until the Catholic Church took it over in the 325 year, and they turned it into every Sunday meeting where you do the communion wafer instead of a Passover service in a correct form. So yes, you should get circumcised if you want to do the Passover at the temple. Now, you can do a Passover in a person's home. Maybe that's different, and you don't have to get circumcised. That's a different question. But definitely when the Passover was done at the temple, you would have to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, he says, and uncircumcision is nothing. Well, circumcision is extremely important to God. So it is something. It's something important if you want to not abominate his temple. And that's unquestionable what God says about that. Instead, he says keeping God's commandments is what counts. Well, one of the commandments of God is you have to be circumcised if you want to go into the temple, if you want to celebrate Passover there, if you want to do an atonement there. You don't have to do atonement there. You don't have to go to Passover there as a Gentile. But if you do, you must obey God's command and you must be circumcised. But he's saying, he's acting like circumcision has no legal status at all. Because otherwise, why would he say circumcision is nothing? Instead, keeping God's commandments is what counts, when a actual commandment of God is to be circumcised in those two situations. That's what I mean. He biblically seems to be, it's got to be like, whatever that demon is doing, that angel Satan that's tormenting in his flesh, actually, I think has corrupted his mind, because this is over the top crazy. And yet Christians will defend this. The Christian theologians will act like this is normal way of talking. No, it's ridiculous. It's absurd beyond belief. So let's review from Elliot Friedman, commentary on the Torah, of when a Gentile must be circumcised relating to the Passover or going to the temple. If the ger, that's what we're called, wishes, and that's translated often as alien, resident alien, or foreigner, or sojourner. But basically means a person who's in fellowship with the people of Israel by living in their community. If the ger wishes to enter the temple, while Friedman does not explicitly discuss a general temple entry permit. So I had asked this question to the database. So what you do with Notebook LM is you put the PDF up in there, and then you can ask questions, and it goes through an amazing, well, you'll read it right here. The answer I got for my question is, when do we have to, as Gentiles, be circumcised? Okay. And it says right here, while Friedman, by the way, I've been circumcised as a Bronx kid in the 1950s. We had that as part of the New York health practices. I don't know if it's still the law, but many people have already been circumcised in the United States without even having been involved consciously doing it. Anyway, let's listen. While Friedman does not explicitly discuss a general temple entry permit for the ger in the provided text, he translates the Passover law, Exodus 12:48, I cited it earlier, as saying the circumcised alien, meaning the ger, may, quote, come forward to do it. Quote, coming forward, the Hebrew GRV, generally implies approaching the sanctuary or altar. So the idea there is the particular meaning of the word come forward to do it at the temple is why it triggers the duty to be circumcised, because now you're in this region where God's holiness requires no one uncircumcised goes past that point. Coming forward generally implies approaching the sanctuary altar. Furthermore, Friedman references Ezekiel 44:7-9, which forbids those uncircumcised of heart and uncircumcised of flesh from entering the sanctuary, meaning the temple, in his discussion of the foreskin of the heart. So we have multiple reasons why God's law requires this, and it can't be just said that circumcision is nothing. It's absolutely everything to God. You're going to abominate his temple. It's like bringing in poison, whatever it is, into somebody's home and say, do you mind if I have this poison gas with me? Yeah, I do. You can't get out of my house. That's how it is to God. It's an abomination to him. That's what it says in Ezekiel. All right, so let's read Ezekiel 44:9, World English. The Lord Yahweh says, quote, no foreigner, meaning the ger, the sojourner, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter into my sanctuary, meaning the temple, of any foreigners who are among the children of Israel. So that's a law, right? These are laws. These are commandments. Paul is saying there is no such thing. There's no commandments. There's nothing. You can do whatever you want. There is no commandment. And in fact, if you get circumcised, you're severed from Christ. So if you obey a commandment, you severed from Christ. You've lost your salvation. You're going to hell by obeying God's law. Do you see the incongruity? Doing what you're supposed to do, obeying God's law, getting circumcised to celebrate Passover if you wanted to, or if you wanted to do an atonement, which you can do at the temple, you've now deprived yourself. You're circumcised. You're severed from Christ. That's what he's saying. So let's look at the other verse that Friedman cited, which was Exodus 12:48, World English. When a stranger lives as a foreigner with you and would like to keep the Passover to Yahweh, notice it's a wish, a will, a desire, but not a demand, a command, and would like to keep the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near, that is, to enter the temple per Friedman. So the Passover could be celebrated at the temple, and that's what this is talking about, and keep it. So you could keep the Passover at the temple. He shall be as one who is born in the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. So Paul is saying that if you wanted to celebrate the Passover, which was, like I said, going on for a couple hundred years till the Catholic Church changed everything into a weekly Sunday wafer thing, people only treated a Passover as something you celebrate once a year. And you go to Jerusalem if you could. And until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, you would have this requirement that you had to be circumcised to go into the temple to do the Passover activities. So if they did that, Paul is saying, if you do that, you're severed from Christ. You shouldn't have become circumcised. It's wrong to do that. It's abhorrent to Paul for whatever reason. Doesn't make any sense to me. Can anybody tell me why he would say to do this? It doesn't make sense. When God's law commands you to do something, to go into his temple to celebrate Passover, how can Paul countermand it? Oh, yeah, it's apostasy. It's total outright apostasy, rebellion from God's law. And that's a Deuteronomy 13, 1-10, death penalty. But of course, Paul can't be executed because he's a Herodian family member. There you got Roman citizenship from birth, and so he can't be killed. So whatever. That's why he's with impunity saying these horrible things that are absolute apostasy, and he knows he can't be arrested and put to jail. Friedman did cite one other verse. So let's take one more look at it. Ezekiel 44:6-7. I want to point out a couple of things. You shall tell the rebellious, that is guilty of apostasy. So anybody who doesn't follow this principle, like Paul, would be considered an apostate. And it's right here in Ezekiel 44:6. You shall tell the rebellious, the apostates, even the house of Israel, the Lord Yahweh says, you, house of Israel, let that be enough of all your abominations. So letting in these foreigners is what he's talking about. In that you have brought in foreigners, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, to be in my sanctuary, to profane it, even my house. So God Yahweh really doesn't like it. Paul is trying to condemn anybody who gets circumcised to guard against violating God's law, violating this situation here where it's an abomination and God hates it. And I think anybody who does this kind of crime, it's a death penalty according to the law at the temple. It even has a little doorway that shows you, it says in several languages, that if you go past this point uncircumcised, you're going to be subject to a death penalty. And so that's to enforce this law. And Paul's acting like it's no big deal. Oh, you don't have to be circumcised. You can do whatever you want. I'm sorry. And if I got circumcised to go in there, he's clearly saying I am subject to being severed from Christ because I'm doing something that God told me to do, but Paul's telling me don't do it. Don't do it. If you're uncircumcised, don't get circumcised. He says that flat out. He doesn't give any exceptions to it. He's his own little demigod, it appears. So let's go back to the opening slide. Did Paul incite rebellion, that is apostasy, against God's law of circumcision as to a Christian Gentile who merely wished to participate in Passover temple services, in which case circumcision has become necessary? So the answer to that is yes. He incited apostasy, turning away from God's law, telling you to not obey it, don't do it. You'll be severed from Christ if you do it. So there's no circumstances in which you have to do it. He's making it sound like it's an absolute prohibition to get circumcised. Okay? Then he's telling the person, you will be severed from Christ. Therefore, you don't want that to happen, right? You want to go to heaven. But if you want to be damned, you obey God's law to get circumcised. That's the odd thing. You are damned to hell for obeying God's law to be circumcised. He knows better. He has to know better, really. Is he this dumb? Is he that biblically ignoramus, as Tobias Singer says? It's a toss-up. But whatever it is, he's either completely apostate or he's pretending to be an apostate. He's just seeding so much confusion and definitely division within the church. And part of me goes back to the Roman agent theory. There is a reason why he would do this as a Roman agent. Because if you can keep the Gentiles from being in Asia Minor, for example, which is a Gentile territory, most of it, and they don't want to come anymore to Jerusalem because if they do, they would be asked to be circumcised. They don't want to confront that anymore. Instead of thinking it's a good thing to do, they're going to be afraid of it because by doing it, they're going to be severed from Christ. So better not even go there anymore. Don't participate. And what you end up having is a division between the Jewish people or followers of Christ in Judea. They're going to stay there, and the converts that Paul is creating in the foreign lands are all going to stay over there. Nobody's going to fellowship anymore. So if you look in Acts 21, the Jews of Asia came over from Asia Minor. That's the other part of modern Turkey. And so they were co-festing, meaning they were having festivals together at the temple at the time of the Pentecost, prefatory period before Pentecost. So they're getting along, they're fellowshipping. What he would like to do is divide that up so they never want to participate together with each other. And those Jews from Asia might not come unless there's a large interest by Gentiles, so they may no longer come. So that's what he's trying to do. Potentially, arguably, that would make more sense than this crazy idea, the statements he made. And let's just look at them one more time to see how truly insane they are, because that's the nicest word I can put for it. All right, so don't forget the 3 verses that we're talking about. Galatians 5, verse 2. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. No. Yes, if you're circumcised, Christ will profit you everything if you go into the temple and try to participate in Passover, to celebrate Jesus' annually celebrate Jesus' Passover by recreating what he did. That would be a normal thing to do. And Christ will profit you everything. Why wouldn't he? It would only be if you didn't get circumcised and try to go to the temple and do a Passover service. Then you would be violating God's law and be subject to a death penalty. On this wall, there's a sign that says you pass this wall and you're not circumcised, you're dead. Okay, so that's number one. That's a totally false statement. Galatians 5:4, you who are trying to be justified by the law, meaning following Exodus 12, verse 48, and Ezekiel 44, 7-9, for a foreigner to enter the temple, you have to be circumcised. You have been severed by Christ. So that's somebody telling you that by obeying God's law, you have been severed from Christ. Then that's never happened that way. It'd be actually, if you were violating this law, maybe you'd be severed from Christ. But as long as you're following in the law and getting circumcised and doing what's just and right under the law, being justified by obeying God's law, yes, that you would never be severed from Christ. You're doing the exact same right things you're supposed to do. Paul has it completely screwed up backwards. And then he says, you've fallen from grace. And again, to repeat, read Exodus 20, verse 6. It says right there, in the KJV, I extend mercy to those who love me and do what? Obey my commandments. You would have obeyed God's commandments. You would get grace because you were doing the right thing. If you didn't obey this commandment, God would not give you mercy, and you'd probably be judged very harshly here. Okay, Galatians 5:12. I wish these agitators would go so far as to castrate themselves. This shows you the harsh and mean-spirited way that Paul deals with people. He doesn't try to have rational discussions and try to debate verses and study the words carefully of Exodus or Ezekiel. No, he's just going to use bad language and show that he's got a lot of chutzpah. He's a pretty thuggish way of talking, and he's just trying to be a belligerent person, and somehow people will be intimidated by him. So fortunately, we can now see through all this transparent posturing by Paul. It's nothing. It's a nothing burg. Just ignore it. Just realize you're not reading somebody who knows God's word at all, or is a Roman agent and doesn't care about God's word. He's just trying to create division and sow discord within the church and divide the Jews and the Gentiles from each other. And this exactly has that consequences. Gentiles who don't get circumcised and are trying to fellowship with Jewish people would find a lot of difficult moments, particularly if they get towards the temple and they want to go celebrate together. The Jew's going to have to say, are you circumcised or not? And if you say, no, I'm not, it's going to not happen. And Paul is trying to sow the seed that nothing like that will happen. There will be no more circumcised Gentiles, and therefore there will be no more fellowship, or at least a lot less fellowship at the temple on an annual basis, which is a big deal in that era. That would have been a wonderful thing to do, but he's trying to stop it. He wants to put a stop to that kind of fellowship between Jew and Gentile. All right, God bless. Take care, everybody. Ciao, bye.